Thank you, everyone. Thank you. So the title for my talk, The Imperative for Planetary Design, is adapted from Spivak's 1999 essay, The Imperative to Reimagine the Planet. There, she proposes the figure of the planet to override the globe. Globalization, she says, is achieved by the imposition of the same system of exchange everywhere. Instead, the planet is in the species of alterity, belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it. Indeed, we are it. The left need not give up the space of possibility of the globe and retreat to the local. Indeed, the proliferation of terms, each with its own particular slant, planet, world, Gaia, terra, monde, attests to this turn. This is a necessary first step of many. We'll get to the others. As for design, I would like to make the following proposition. Carl Friedman, a student of Marxist cultural critic Frederick Jameson, makes the case for the affinity between critical theory and science fiction. He defines science fiction as a genre of cognitive estrangement, which encourages to think of alternative fictional worlds which nevertheless can still be rationally considered. On the other hand, he defines critical theory as dialectical thought that criticizes the world up to its own rational methods. Not only do both genres overlap, but they have a natural predisposition to one another. They are sister projects. Now, here, I think it wouldn't be too hard to convincingly argue that design, which by necessity operates in a projective or speculative mode, would naturally fit in a triad, just like Elizabeth Olsen, the lesser-known sister of the famous Olsen twins. Why planetary design? Two reasons. Put bluntly, first, our political imagination is depleted. Maybe we all agree about that. Second, the left has no progressive aesthetic project. I find this scandalous, but of course I would. I will turn to each briefly. Politics. Consider history since Fukuyama announced its supposed ending. Just this week, the Anthropocene was officially recognized as a geological epoch by the International Union of Geological Sciences. It's a bittersweet moment when the reopening of history means the end of the world. The handling of the 2007 crash conclusively exposed neoliberalism as a farce indefensible by its beneficiaries and unsustainable for its victims. Privatizing profits, socializing losses was one way to put it. I prefer manifest destiny for the billionaires, existentialism for the rest. Occupy Wall Street spearheaded social movements around the world. Piketty's capital became the economic equivalent of the lengthy mathematical proof that 1 + 1 = 2. But when a fed-up public got the chance to choose, we got Brexit, Trump, and the general regression of democracy. The silver lining to this dark moment is that political change is possible, but in the absence of an agreeable progressive alternative, the world is being drained of whatever solidarity it has left, retrenching into ethno-nationalism and xenophobia. As Barthes has argued, and as the cases of Hobbes' Leviathan and Rousseau's Noble Savage illustrate, new political imaginaries require new myths. And what bigger myth than nature and its corollary human nature? But more on this later. Now, for aesthetics, the nature of the aesthetic projects endorsed by the hegemonic left reveals concerning degrees of conservatism. They include hippie communes steeped in New Age mythologies, romantic exaltations of the local or the vernacular, the pre-modern, Luddite, primitivist retrotopias of Tolkien, Disney-like degenerate simulacra, or in the most pragmatic case, the new urbanism of Andres Duany. At the same time, for all the vilification of capitalism, we must admit that its allure lies in its visions of abundance regardless of its uneven distribution or self-destructive tendencies. Benjamin once described fascism as the aestheticization of politics and communism as the politicization of art. We need a more nuanced understanding of the link between politics and aesthetics. To this end, Rancière has proposed the notion of the aesthetic regime. More than opposing politics to art, he explores their interrelations productively. How are political ideas linked to artistic visions, representation modes, and stylistic conventions? For him, politics is already a form of experience which takes place in the spaces that constitute it aesthetically. In the same way, certain aesthetic regimes are recruited for specific political ends. Every political act operates or generates a certain aesthetic. This is what Zizek calls Ranzier's discovery of the aesthetic element inherent in the political. So aesthetics and politics are dimensions proper to every phenomenon, unhierarchically nested within each other. We must keep this in mind. So what is planetary design? I'd like to suggest 6 attractors that bear upon the trajectory or orbit of planetary design. In adjectival form, they describe simply the different inflections the trajectory can take depending on the point of view from which it is seen. I have identified these 6 terms organically through what eventually became a comparative literature survey. The 6 attractors are total, cosmic, cornucopian, futural, enlightened, and re-enchanted. If the names sound clumsy or unfamiliar, that's a good sign. You will note some contradictions and several overlaps and continuities. This is a feature, not a bug. So I'll go over them quickly. Total. By 2050, the world's population will be somewhere between 9 and 10 billion. Ecology must be understood in terms of this fact, argues Matteo Guidoni. He defines ecology as the discipline that aims at the survival of the human species in the long term and pursues this goal by considering the world as a totality. I disagree with Guidoni's unabashed anthropocentrism, but we'll get to that. Ecology for him is realism starting from the totality. Now, this ecology is in need of a theory, but no such theory currently exists, he argues. The misery of ecological thinking is, of course, a misery of a theoretical misery. Broadly speaking, he suggests, ecology would first require abandoning any spoiled irritation about realism, any nihilistic criticism of the universal, any unnecessary distrust of the common, but more importantly, it would imply overcoming the uninterrupted denigration campaign against the totality, which has been carried out pretty much by everyone over the last 70 years. Indeed, a new ecological thinking has to be developed from the point of view of the totality according to Lukács' formula. I'm going to skip this part just for the sake of time. The second, cornucopian. As Hardy observes, the ecological movements are full of competing claims as to the possible future of the human species. Ecocentrism against naked anthropocentrism, individualism against collectivism, historico-geographic accounts at odds with the bastardized universalism of the natural sciences, and any combination of these. There's also a litany of enemies: enlightenment, reason, modernity, materialism, technology, multinationals, the World Bank, patriarchy, capitalism, free markets, private property, consumerism, and so on. Then add to these the complexities of ontology and epistemology, and the debates are enough to engage participants at learned conferences until kingdom come. Finding consensus seems impossible, yet, as Lee Phillips argues, what most, if not all, left environmental movements have in common is a worldview defined by scarcity, or what he calls the politics of limits. At heart, these views are conservative and misanthropic. In his view, rejection of growth is either a rejection of progress or a belief that we can expand, but only in non-material forms. But the dialectics of the life process suggests that knowledge will always be inextricably linked to the material. No new knowledge depends on old technologies, old stuff, and gives rise to new technologies and new stuff. Now, to clarify, Phillips suggests that more than anti-consumerism, we should be pro-union. More than obsessing about ecological footprints, we should focus on fair redistribution. And beyond the dead end of trying to distinguish between what are each individual's wants and needs, we should define democratically the conditions of collective emancipation. The enemy is therefore not scale, the big or the global, but capital. The enemy is not growth, but growth under capital's needs for self-valorization, irrational growth, and lack of planning. This is an exciting opportunity to develop an ecological thinking corresponding to an affirmative biopolitics where human will isn't pitted by default against nature, but also where the increasingly ordered complexity of life isn't antithetical to the anthropic nature of the universe. Scarcity is anti-humanist, but celebrations of excess won't do either. Turning hard into contingent limits is still being prey of the politics of limits. Aren't we focusing too much on the means and too little on the ends? Or let's double down on limits, but question them through the lens of new eschatologies. Cosmic. Spivak's seminal work made evident the need to critically reevaluate the terms under which we envision the world. To this end, she gave us worlding as a verb and planetarity as a noun. The possibilities opened have been a boon for a new line of post-Stengerian cosmopolitanism. Indeed, Christian Moraro observes a planetary turn, and Bruno Latour, the Prince of Networks, has also embraced the geo prefix. In his most recent book, Down to Earth, he proposes a new terrestrial attractor to break and reorient the global-local axis that governs our political affinities. What these efforts to develop new politics have in common is their embrace of a difficult unity of inclusion rather than the easy unity of exclusion. But why foreclose future flourishing potentials by circumscribing our ecological imagination to the earthly horizon? How would an ecological sensibility oriented towards the cosmos differ from one oriented towards the terrestrial? Carl Sagan reminds us we are made of stardust. Cosmos is the word Humboldt used to title his magnum opus. For him, the term represented the marriage of the study of the earth, geography, with the study of the sky, uranography. Humboldt acknowledged the fundamental role of human imagination and speculation in making and framing science. Ultimately, his encompassing view suggests that to lose the sense of heavens is to risk losing also that of the earth. Futural. Our political crisis is a paralysis of the political imaginary, whose chief effect is the cancellation of the future. Capitalism accelerates the pace of change, except we are running on a treadmill. In their manifesto for acceleration of politics, the authors suggest that perhaps the most important rift in today's left is between those who hold to parochial politics of localism, direct action, and horizontalism, and a new group of so-called accelerationists who are at ease with the modernity of abstraction, complexity, globality, and technology. So far, the former has been content with establishing small and temporary spaces of neo-capitalist social relations, ignoring the very real monstrous forces which are intrinsically non-local, abstract, and rooted deep in our systems and infrastructures. With neoliberal forces foreclosing the future, history becomes nothing but a mere countdown. Civilization becomes an extinction waiting game. How can we simultaneously reject grand narratives when the grandest of all unfolds before our eyes, except it's like a red carpet being rolled backwards, disconnecting the present from the future? This is the postmodern hermeneutics of suspicion acting like a self-imposed handicap. Rebelling against this anti-enlightened ideology is our most pressing task. Futurability requires we revisit the taboos of teleology. Enlightenment. Consider that Donald Trump's election represents a blow that tore open the dark underbelly of society. In the aftermath, like the haruspices of ancient Rome, cultural commentators scrambled to perform an exegesis of the spilled guts. More than social or geographical divides, a more powerful heuristic to interpret our current political moment has to do with the idea of the Enlightenment. Our contemporary world is radically anti-enlightenment, declares philosopher Marina Garcés in her book New Radical Enlightenment. Surprisingly, she reaches this conclusion without mention of Nick Land's Dark Enlightenment and its ties to White House operatives. Land's piece, which has served as a sort of manifesto for the new global neo-reactionary movement, is a full frontal assault to the democratic and egalitarian pillars of liberal society since the Enlightenment. I'm skipping everything. Anyway, even Frederick Jameson extolled the utopian potential of Walmart. And lastly, reenchantment. Geographer Neil Smith observes that for all its analytical anti-Semitism, the left has failed in producing an effective anti-ideology of nature capable of combining the material realities of the forces of production together with a deep emotional and symbolic dimension able to capture our imagination. As to where such a project of reenchantment could begin, he points at the desolate junction between political economy and poetics. If this enchantment translates into a strictly materialist naturalism, then it was Darwin's theory what delivered the death blow to teleology. In other words, evolution is a process with no ulterior goal other than conjugating creatures with their environment strictly in the present tense. Unlike progress, it is blind to the future. But how to argue for matter that thinks? And what are the consequences of this affirmation? Yeah?
No, you can come to a conclusion.
As the cosmist poet Evad Ilyankov muses in the cosmology of the spirit, mind emerges from matter. But in a dialectical moment, a subtler materialism would also hold that matter cannot exist without thought. The purpose of enlightenment is not reaching perfection or gaining absolute knowledge, but something endlessly greater. A vision of cosmology where the destinies of mind and matter are inexorably intertwined. This, of course, is impossible under the current Darwinian materialist account of nature. Quoting Dorian Sagan, understanding ourselves as exponents of a natural rather than a special teleology is, I would argue, a scientific satori that gets to the root of the connectedness of all things. It brings together Darwin and Spinoza, Gaia and microbial ecology, phenomenology and materialism. We've been here before, looking for the holy grail that dispels the Rashomon effect that subsumes material reality. So let's go even further and say that perhaps, as specialized scientific knowledge suggests, yes, the universe does not pose a grand existential question we ought to answer. 42. If that's the case, so be it. But then let's apply a Jeopardy-style reversal to their materialist reductionism to the materialist reductionist approach to inquiry, and entertain for a minute the possibility that the ascension to the 10th level of intellectual heaven would be if we found the question to which the universe is the answer, and the nature of that question in and of itself explains why it was possible to describe it in so many different ways. And for conclusion, I was just going to shut up. Thank you.
Thank you.